Live is good. I'll admit, everyone.
Hello. Welcome everyone to this year's World Goodwill Seminar. Envisaging a new global culture, the search for unity between East and West. The New York seminar is the last of 3 today. And so we're building on the inspired thinking and discussions of the Geneva and London meetings that took place earlier on. As we discussed in a recent letter to students of the Arcane School, humanity is currently moving through a difficult transition period between the old age and the new, and the general world picture seems to be one of political fragmentation in the West, juxtaposed with the growing economic might of China in the East, a nation we should bear in mind that represents 1/5 of the world's population. And it's in the context of this scenario that we can address the challenging question, along what lines might the contrasting ideologies of the East and West evolve and converge to express a point of planetary synthesis? The journalist and political commentator Martin Jack has long contended that China is more a civilization state than a nation state. And he points out that the most important political value for the Chinese people is unity through their strong sense of ancient cultural identity. Having a weak concept of cultural difference and little tolerance of it, China is unlikely to conform to the Western ways of liberal democracy. Individual human rights will always be viewed in the context of maintaining the cultural integrity of Chinese civilization. So Professor Jock maintains that China cannot be understood by observing it through Western eyes and values. The problem, he says, is well summarized by a preeminent historian of China, Paul Cohen, who remarked that while the West may regard itself as the most cosmopolitan of all the cultures, in many ways it is the most parochial. And this is because for the past 200 years, the West has been so dominant in the world, it has not really needed to understand other civilizations and cultures, which, by contrast, have been forced to understand the West because of its strong presence in their societies. According to Jacques, East Asia is the world's largest economy with 1/3 of the world's population, and it is far more knowledgeable about the West than the West is about East Asia. So this is relevant because the world is now starting to be driven and shaped not by the old developed countries, but by the developing world, which sees that the West has failed to live up to the promise of the liberal international order it set up at the end of the Second World War. At that time, the global economy began operating under liberal political and economic principles established by the West, accompanied by the high ideal of promoting democratic values and social cohesion around the world. In the 80s, however, an excessive relaxation of government regulations on trade and capital flows transferred too much power into the realm of economics and finance. And so one of the effects of this has been to increase control of the global economy by a wealthy elite and to further obstruct the spiritual law that demands the equitable distribution of the world's resources amongst all people in all lands. In Eurasia and the developing economies of the global south are seeking to escape from poverty under a new form of international order that enables them to acquire a fairer share of the world's economic produce. And the failure by the West to circulate resources more evenly within their own domestic economies highlights the real need for a radical new vision around which to formulate a spiritual plan of progress towards the divine. The truth of the proverb, where there is no vision, the people perish, is becoming ever more apparent in societies which are in danger of sliding into social unrest and moral decay. And one of the problems that has led to the current world malaise is a psychological one, and it's been described by the neuroscience researcher Ian McGilchrist in terms of the unbalanced relationship between the two hemispheres of the brain. He addresses the problem of an overemphasis on the intellectual, detail-oriented type of thinking in the following way. The left hemisphere, he says, is designed to aid you in grabbing stuff. Its purpose is utility, and its evolutionary adaptation lies in the service of grasping and amassing things. As such, it is seductive. It is probably for this reason that Eastern cultures, which used to be more balanced in their outlook, are now adopting the current Western model of the world with such enthusiasm and appear set, very sadly, on outdoing the West at its own pernicious game. It is my view that we should be learning from them, not they from us. And he goes on to say that the left hemisphere loves straight lines, not curves or circles. No straight lines are found in the natural world. Everything that really exists follows a series of curved shapes to which the logical products of the human mind can only ever approach tangentially. Flow, reduced to a series of points, is illusory and can only be approximated by narrowing the breadth and limiting the depth of the perceptual field. So straight lines are prevalent wherever the left hemisphere predominates. In the late Roman Empire, the towns and roads were laid out like grids. In Classicism, in contrast with the Baroque, which had everywhere celebrated the curve. In the Industrial Revolution, by the functional brutality of the rectilinear production of machines, and in the grid-like environment of the modern city. And by contrast, the shape that is suggested by the processing of the right hemisphere is that of the circle, and its movement is characteristically in the round. The phrase we use to describe something that's seen as a whole and in depth. Circular motion accommodates a coming together of opposites. Cognition in the right hemisphere is not a process of something coming into being through adding piece to piece in a sequence, but of something that is out of focus, coming into focus as a whole. Everything is understood within its penumbra of significances, in its context, all that encircles it. So it's clear that is a rebalancing of the two hemispheres of the brain that is needed in a global sense in the way nations behave. So we'll be exploring today, drawing on some thoughts from Confucianism, which seems to be undergoing a revival in China, even if there is widespread criticism that is being used by its government as a propaganda tool to support a political agenda, both domestically and internationally, mobilizing the power of the energy of goodwill, we place our emphasis on a more positive vision, for there is much to learn from leading East Asian thinkers on the cultural values of Confucianism and the part it may have to play in helping the people of East Asia onto the path of freedom that humanity is collectively forging towards the spiritual realms. In an article entitled The Confucian Concept of Freedom, Professor of Chinese Philosophy Li Chengyang writes, the Confucian concept of freedom does not imply an unencumbered free will as the origin and originator of choice. Instead, the agency of freedom is the person through the heart-mind. And as agency, the choosing person is always situated in an environment that is fundamentally social in nature. The Confucian ideal of freedom has to be achieved in the context of human society, and liberty is indispensable to a healthy human society. Confucianism must have room. If it has not, it must make room for liberty. Moreover, if the main goal of Confucianism is to achieve human freedom as choosing the good, then it must support and promote social institutions that contribute to such a goal. So whether it's in the East or the West, this path to liberty in a social context involves a steady transition from the individual mindset to that of the collective. Humanity's understanding of freedom is evolving slowly but surely, and insular concepts of freedom are being challenged. Their voluntary sacrifice for the greater good of society being one of the lessons of this period. And this leads us to speculate on how the contrasting ideologies of the East and West on matters such as freedom, human rights, and global unity might steadily evolve and converge to express a point of planetary synthesis. So to take us through the theme of the seminar, we are so fortunate to have two excellent speakers, Professor Jack Bagby, who researches the history of philosophy and focuses on problems related to consciousness, nature, and evolution, and Jack McDaniel, who is Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Hendrix College in Arkansas and founder of the website Open Horizons, which explores a vision of life based on process philosophy. So for a more detailed introduction, I'll now pass you across to Michael Galloway, the director of the New York Center, and he'll be welcoming and engaging Jack Bagby in discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Jack, for being here. Jay and Chris, we're going to be speaking maybe for about 45 minutes, so if you guys want to shut your videos off during that time, you're more than welcome to. So, welcome, Jack. Really, it's a pleasure and honor for us to have you here with us today. So I'll start off just with a brief introduction so our audience here knows a little bit about you. Jack received his MA and PhD in philosophy from Boston College in 2021. Also a BA in philosophy and ancient Greek language from Pennsylvania State University in 2013. He is currently professor of philosophy at the California Institute of Integral Studies in their Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness department. Professor Bagby conducts research on the history of philosophy from a phenomenological perspective. He focuses on problems related to consciousness, nature, and aesthetics. He has published on ancient Greek philosophy, Henri Bergson, and Baruch Spinoza. He has strong research interests in 19th and 20th century European philosophy, especially process philosophy, transcendental philosophy, and French spiritualism, as well as the philosophy of music. He was co-editor and contributor to the recent book, Meter and Music in Ancient Greece. And he is currently working on two major book projects, one on French spiritualism and the phenomenology of music. And he's also developing research on Nishida Kitaro's philosophy of life. So, Jack, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
Yeah. So today, Jack will be helping us better understand what it really means to bridge between the East and West through the lens of Eastern and Western philosophy. So there are a few specific thinkers we do plan to bring in, specifically Henri Bergson and Nishida Kitaro, if I'm saying his name correctly. And so we also do plan to speak about the California Institute of Integral Studies, Jack, where you teach, and about how higher education and the practice of philosophy is sort of supporting this bridge building at a cultural level in one sense, but also through the means of philosophy going sort of to a deeper level as well. As we know, philosophy deals with sort of the big questions, the nature of reality, the nature of subjectivity, of perception, the nature of time and the unfolding of time, and this sort of dialectic between self and the cosmos. And so, from one perspective, all that could be said to underlie culture and sort of the problems of culture as well. So that's a really broad range. So we do only have 45 minutes, so we'll just see where it goes. And yeah. And just to the audience, feel free to type in the chat, type comments and questions. During this 45-minute session, we won't be taking any questions from the chat, but we will later in the seminar, towards the end, we'll have a panel with with Jack and with Jay. And at that point, we will definitely be taking questions from the chat. So either share them now, or you can save them and share them later. So Jack, to get us started and sort of set the stage for our discussion, could you share, maybe begin by sharing a bit about what you see are some of the major differences and perhaps similarities between Eastern and Western thinking and philosophizing generally? And I know it's very sort of imprecise to generalize. You philosophers are very, very specific for very good reason, but perhaps we could start with sort of more of a general picture, and then as we progress, we can go into more of the nuance and specifics.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's a good place to start, although it is a question that's maybe either unanswerable or, when we answer it, we kind of undo the question itself to some degree. Within the West, there are multiple tendencies. Some of those tendencies are consonant with tendencies that we find in the East, and there's differences. And I think actually the question of the difference between East and West and the interaction between Bergson and Nishida really weave together, because Nishida was one of the first philosophers, at least in Japan, to seriously ask this question and to attempt something like a hybridization of Eastern and Western approaches to philosophy. You could go for the McGilchrist dichotomy between the right brain and the left brain and say that the West tends to overemphasize the left brain, and the East has more of a sense of the of the right brain. And the interesting thing is Bergson's role here. So Bergson at this era, around the time of Nishida, was, the turn of the century, was the most famous philosopher in the world, and has kind of lost that prestige. People don't really even realize that he had this big debate with Einstein that was famous around the world. He was more or less the world famous philosopher, and maybe one of the last times there was one, although you have in France many celebrity philosophers throughout the 20th century. But Nishida attempts to enter the global conversation and sees Bergson as already going against the Western tendencies and breaking with those tendencies, and sees within the focus on duration, immediate experience, consciousness, a critique of our conceptual understanding of the world, and really focusing on life and creativity and embodiment and these themes as resonant with Japanese thought in general, and really bringing out of the Zen tradition and Japanese thought what is most Japanese about it. He actually speaks about it this way: We see this actually with a number of Bergson's followers, such as Leopold Senghor, who was eventually president of Senegal. He also draws on Bergson and basically says that there's something Bergsonian about African consciousness that goes against the Western consciousness. So people were seeing, and the French obviously loved Bergson. They thought he was the essence of French thought as well. But certainly he was breaking with many of the dominant traditions within European thought and what we might call Western thought. And when we really dig at that too, though, we find a lineage, because Bergson's thought is in a lineage with Plato and in some sense Aristotle, and certainly with Plotinus. He is doing something different than these thinkers, and he is pushing against, especially at the time, the 19th, 20th century, reductionism and eliminativism being philosophies that deny the existence of consciousness or spirit, or attempt a description of reality entirely through mechanical causality or natural necessity, and the questions related to freedom and all of this which surround that. But I think one last thought on that, and preempting where we're heading, is that for Nishida, he could approach the global conversation that he didn't see as European or Japanese or any kind of nationality, but this kind of open conversation philosophically going on. And he saw himself as a peer alongside William James, Bergson, Mach, these revolutionary thinkers at the time, who were attempting to really be eclectic, draw from all possible traditions, and overthrow all of the prior systems and just rethink from scratch how we understand reality. And he saw himself in that. And so what we find is him really not being true to the history of certain ideas. He'll pull from Hegel, he'll pull from Kant, he'll pull from Fichte. And it doesn't matter if he's doing it faithfully, because what he's doing is starting again the task of philosophy. And I think that this is what we see in Bergson and in Nishida, that really transcends these distinctions between East and West and opens a dialogue in which they can both give concepts, and we can use concepts in new ways derived from them.
It's really interesting, Jack. Thank you. It's interesting to just that last thought you shared. It's interesting to keep in mind for our audience, and the esoteric philosophy of our founder, Alice Bailey, was a sort of a continuation or an evolution of Helena Blavatsky's work, which was really around just before, around the same time as both of these thinkers. And so this idea of philosophizing and just sort of pulling from everybody and not really worrying about, is it literally this or literally that, is definitely a major part of the whole essence of what esoteric philosophy is that it's like a golden thread through everything almost, and so
and when you turn to immediate experience, that's the ultimate testing ground, right? So we have these concepts and we can reuse them, but it's not as if it's just a fantasy play. We go to this immediate experience. And actually Bergson and Blavatsky were friends. They did seances together and things like this. And really the immediate experience being the touchstone, right, of experience, of truth, and of where philosophy is headed. I think that's very consonant.
So just before we jump into Bergson fully, I have one more just brief question about sort of along the lines of culture, and that is sort of to set the stage for everything else we're going to do and to keep us aligned with our theme. Do you see any trends in terms of the way around that time, that sort of early 20th century, the trends in thinking in the East and the West being affected by these philosophers? So would you say that was sort of was this the beginning of philosophy being maybe a more major part of thinking generally in both East and West, or not? I know philosophy in general we consider more prominent in the East in terms of its effect on daily life. So how do you see that sort of conversation developing as a result of these?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the historical question is a bit tricky because Bergson and Nishida both get eclipsed by later thinkers, especially for Bergson, Heidegger, and the phenomenological tradition. And for Nishida, his immediate successors, Nishitani, Watsuji, these people studied with Heidegger or were directly influenced by Heidegger. And so there's this movement towards German phenomenology and these questions, and away from Bergson and Nishida as kind of the beginning of that. And no doubt those two thinkers set the stage for that to happen. And it couldn't have happened without that. But so that's like one of these difficulties of history, because even in like continental programs in the United States, which just basically means the people who study European philosophy, Bergson does not play a big role, and has really lost favor to the phenomenological tradition that comes after him. That's changing right now, especially because of Gilles Deleuze, who is a big proponent of Bergson's philosophy. And actually, Nishida is having a big resurgence along with Bergson, partially because of that, and partially just because his thought is really interesting. But I would say that they did both, in their own ways, irreversibly change history and played a major role in the cultural shifts of their time. I mean, Bergson is really interesting, and we're moving in this direction anyway, so I guess I can go here. But he was in a way fighting a lot of cultural ideas and like cultural trends and things like this, especially towards reductionism, scientism, secularism in France, these kinds of ideas. But he was a big proponent as well of the power of habit and culture and repetition, and sought to guide cultural tendencies in a certain direction rather than fight them and push against them. And I think we can see Nishida in this very similar light. I mean, he thinks that culturally Japan is a formless form, and this really is an idea we would find in Bergson as well. And really, the human is a formless form, but for Nishida, Japanese culture is perfectly open and flexible to adapt to the modern times. It's open to be able to have Western ideas come in without being sort of calcified by those or mechanized by those. Whether or not that panned out entirely is another question. Like Miyazaki, for example, as a filmmaker, ponders this question in the contemporary age. But he thinks that this idea of a formless form, so you're open to malleability, there is coordination, but there's not this highly structured, already determined essence or formula for what a human life looks like, or what flourishing within the culture looks like. I mean, there are certain models that he draws from the Zen arts, especially. And for Bergson, he turns towards evolution and the evolution of form and adaptability. Anyway, as a way to move in this direction of thinking.
Yeah. I mean, that was sort of the next place we were going to go, is really just right into Bergson, maybe a bit more about his ideas. So maybe you could, I mean, it sounds like you already sort of answered this, but sort of where his ideas stand between this bridge between East and West, as well. But maybe just start by giving us maybe a little bit of an deeper overview of his philosophy in that context.
Yeah, all of his works engage with science in some way. He was a thinker who constantly engaged with science, who thought that science was a necessary part of our philosophical thinking, but he was vehemently opposed to reductionism and to eliminativism and to approach to understanding reality that doesn't take firsthand experience as a central touchstone, or as the genesis point even. So his first two works really engaged with psychology, physiology, so Time and Free Will, which was his doctoral thesis, and then Matter and Memory, which looks at the relation between the mind and the body, and draws a lot on psychological and physiological theories at the time. And then his magnum opus, which he's known for, is Creative Evolution, where he takes the ideas developed in the earlier two works and applies them to the question of Darwin and evolution, and tries to form an evolutionary perspective on philosophy itself that doesn't reduce evolution to something mechanical, and also doesn't sort of fall back into an idealism or anything like in Hegel, for example, where history is already plotted out and we just sort of fulfill a project already determined. Bergson, I mentioned he was one of the most famous philosophers in history and was certainly the most famous philosopher during his lifetime in the world. His thought really has disseminated widely and hasn't always been realized. A lot of later philosophers were critical of him, even though they basically adopt wholesale large portions of his philosophy, like somebody like Merleau-Ponty, who I love, but certainly does that. And then, in modern theories like self-organization, people like Ilya Prigogine, or the ideas of autopoiesis, and really the systems approach to life and even ideas in thermodynamics, a lot of these have roots in Bergson's ideas. So he is kind of a hidden figure within the history of Western philosophy and its evolution. And many of the ideas that he was pushing at the turn of the century reemerge again and again in the 50s and 60s in cybernetics and many different fields, oftentimes not knowing that they are rehashing Bergsonism.
Would you say his like insistence on sort of finding the way between the sort of idealism of phenomenology on one hand and the sort of realistic, materialistic, positivistic on the other, would you say that's the sort of primary bridge perhaps to Nishida and to the East?
That's definitely a bridge, for sure. Yeah, and his people called him right after him, like Sartre and some other people, and not necessarily the kindest terms, would have called him a bourgeois meditator or something like this.
Yeah.
Or the Bergson's thought is bourgeois meditation or something. I mean, it certainly has a deep experiential dimension. What is given immediately is our concrete duration, the becoming that we are, that our words cannot fully describe, that our concepts cannot get at. The flow of duration can be broken up into these snapshots, these derivatives, and we can analyze it, but we'll never truly understand it. But just because we won't understand it doesn't mean it's some foreign thing that has no reality to us. It's what we are. So it's the most familiar thing, even though we can't understand it. That is an extremely close description to Zen Buddhism and the idea of pure perception. And actually, Nishida, in his first book, goes for pure perception, gives this extremely Bergsonian description, hasn't read Bergson at this point, then reads Bergson, then writes this other really amazing book called Intuition and Reflection and Self-Consciousness, which is heavily dealing with Bergson. And you really see at that period that he sees in Bergson an analog, or maybe you could say a confirmation, coming to the same idea from a different tradition and with a different framework, but coming to the same conclusion. I mean, I think we could also see this in Sri Aurobindo, for example, who also comes to Bergson's philosophy after having established his own and sees a confirmation there. And to me, these confirmations point towards, and when Whitehead comes along and says many of the same things, and that they're accurately describing reality, and that we need this kind of description.
Excellent, thank you. That sort of leads us now into the next question I wanted to ask, which is that Bergson's conceptions of time, although they're sort of very complex, at least maybe for a non-philosopher, they have a lot of significant implications for his thought and also for his sort of relationship with these later thinkers as well, as you said, especially with this sort of thing he had with Einstein. So could you, we don't have to get into the Einstein discussion, but could you just break down maybe for us his philosophy of time?
Yeah. Christine actually in the opening really described some core elements of it already, and McGilchrist is very open with Bergson being a major influence on his thought. Bergson has this funny quote, every philosopher has one idea.
Yeah.
And his idea is about time. Really, that was the central question of all of his life and thought, and he was working it out in different areas, you might say. What is what is the question of time and how we perceive it, and then how does that influence our understanding of evolution? How does that influence our understanding of culture and society and morality and religion? That really tracks his entire philosophical trajectory. So time for Bergson, another famous snippet, is time is invention or it's nothing. So time is not a measurement system. This is kind of what Aristotle says, although Aristotle's a bit more nuanced than that. But this is the sort of idea that becomes codified in a thinker like Leibniz or Kant, where time is really just this formal structuring of how we experience things. And it's this kind of abstract layer that we paint onto our experience in order to make sense of it. And Bergson says, sure, this is part of what our experience of time is, but it's a derivative form. It's not the original experience of our consciousness. So the original experience of our consciousness for Bergson is a mixture of memory and becoming, the perception we have of the present becoming. And consciousness is time because it's the intermixture or the tension that exists between memory and perception, or memory and becoming, or matter and memory, as he will refer to it. Or instead of matter, you might even say movement, because when we think of matter, we tend to go the Cartesian route. We chop everything up. We see it as partes, extra partes, things outside of each other. That's a phrase from Leibniz. This inert stuff. Well, instead, we should think of it as movement. And movement for Bergson is, we could follow Leibniz actually again on this, a instantaneous mind, or an inchoate consciousness. Movement always has some degree of subjectivity or psychical depth to it, according to Bergson. So he, in a way, spiritualizes matter by focusing on movement, and in a way also brings the mind back in touch with movement, and organicism and life. And really the phenomena of life understood as a temporalization, as a duration, as an evolving flow within time. Not only does that sort of summarize Bergson's philosophy, it's also the exact thread that Nishida picks up within his philosophy. Life as mobility, life as temporal, as, in a way, time is what steps out of itself while staying itself, right? It endures, and the word in French, duration, is related to durability, right? Something being hard and remaining. So it's this paradox, and Nishida loves this paradoxical element, and we also find it in Bergson, that there's a kind of contradictory aspect of duration, and that's why it's always ineffable, right? When we try and analyze it, when we try to understand it, we have to understand something through contradictory terms. It's both finite and infinite. It's both continuous and discrete. It's both multiplicity and unity. So, both Nishida and Bergson attempt to create a, philosophy after that. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, right? Like the duration that can be spoken about is not real duration. Life that can be explained in concepts and put into words isn't life itself. Mm-hmm. But we are that life. We are that duration. So it's true that concepts will always get us stuck. And we see this between these two philosophers. We see this even in Whitehead, that despite those facts, we should still use language. And there is a methodological way to do so. And it pushes us into the murky areas where philosophy and poetry start to resemble one another. And that's the area that both Nishida and Bergson want to go. And both have been ridiculed, I guess, as being imprecise. Bergson, especially, and Nishida falls into this too, takes seriously this question of precision, and I don't think that the opponents to them have properly appreciated their take, because if precision means that we use words that have one definition and put everything into clear and distinct propositions that are exhaustive, we will never reach those absolute realities of life and duration or time, consciousness, even.
Sort of the fallacy of the sort of materialistic paradigm
Mhm.
base, which is exactly what they're arguing against, you know.
And the Whiteheadian phrase, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness,
Yeah.
is deeply resonant with both of these.
Mhm. And so that really has to do with this idea of perception,
Mhm.
Which to me, it's, if you could just describe a bit more about what he thinks about perception. What's interesting, you can say whatever you want, but just say what's interesting for me in the context of this is when I try to apply these theories of time to say to something practical. So maybe actually, let's save that question. Could you stay on this thing of time, and could you describe maybe what apply this theory of time to say what does time mean to say like an individual process, like for Bergson, like the performance of like a piece of music. Like what does time look like for that? Or maybe like the whole life cycle of a human being, or the life cycle of a planet, or
Yeah. Well, it's great. I mean, it's funny the way you asked this question, because you asked a first question about perception, and then I was going to answer that with talking about musical perception.
Yeah.
And then you ended up coming back to the music question, because I mean, it really brings these together. So, I mean, the perception of music was central to Bergson's first book, and really appears again and again, and is a theme that I have worked on a lot. And I mentioned, well, you mentioned that I'm working on this book on phenomenology of music, and the role that the perception of music played not only in Bergson's work, but also in Husserl's internal time consciousness. Really, this was at the heart of all of that philosophy of time coming out at that moment. And Nishida repeats the same idea. So let's just go straight for that, because I think it's it's my favorite thread in this as well.
We love music, so yeah.
But a musical phrase like a melody, if you do any of the mechanical operations on it that we do in matter, we get qualitatively different outcomes. So if you do something like invert the notes, I'm not going to get into the musicological details of what that means, but if you reverse them, or if you make them twice as loud, things like this, you never get a quantitative effect. The effect is always qualitative. You always get like a completely new character, completely new feeling. If you take the rhythm and you double the speed, you don't get something that feels twice as fast. You get something that just feels like a new quality all to itself. Every mechanical or numerical change ends in a qualitatively unique whole, if you will. And this is the model for perception that he wants to apply across the board. Yeah, and you can also think when we talk about there being unity in a piece of music, we mean something very strange, and it's not conceptually clear at first what we mean. There's each individual note, but each individual note does not create the perception of a melody. The perception of a melody involves what we could call a virtuality to it, something beyond what's actual and virtual being kind of opposed to each other here. As we move through the melody, there's more than just what we're hearing at that exact moment. There's the past that came before it, and there's the future towards which it is, creating an anticipation and an expectation. Virtuality is this key concept for not only Bergson, but for Nishida, and then later thinkers like Merleau-Ponty and Deleuze, and I would even argue in Whitehead. It's that the durational, when we approach reality as durational, we are no longer capable of treating just what is actual and just what we can immediately perceive at any given present moment. When you play through half of a melody and then stop, and where it's going, you get this tension in you. And Bergson loves this idea of tension. In perception, we're always anticipating what's coming next. And when we perceive movement, we're never merely perceiving what is in the present. We're perceiving, we could say apperceiving is a fancy word that people use in phenomenology, which means to perceive something that's not there, like depth. These phenomenon of depth and of duration has a certain depth to it for this very reason. There's always something more than what's given in the present moment that is leading to the next moment and retaining the prior moment. All right, let me try and wrap this up and get back to the idea of time, that we tend to spatialize everything because it's practical for us in trying to understand things. We spatialize time by seeing points along a line, or seeing moments laid out in space. In hearing the melody, the prior notes are somehow contained in the present note. Like the present note has the feeling and even the perceptive quality that it has because of its context in time and because of the tonality and the rhythm and these other features. So we need to move from discrete instances, or being able to think of time as what we analyze out of the flow of concrete experience, and instead see it as this, in a way, it's like the water in which a fish swims. We can never look directly at time as duration. It's virtual. It's excess beyond what we perceive and experience. But it's, in a way, again, the most familiar thing, because no matter how diluted we are, we're still concretely durationally becoming.
So to me, that segues really well into pure perception, or I guess what Nishida would call pure experience, perhaps, and what Bergson would call intuition.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak some more about that?
Yeah, well, the phrase pure perception, so there's a few phrases here. There's pure perception, and then for Bergson, there's also pure memory. And then for Nishida, there's pure experience. And these are all related, but they're all slightly different. So pure perception for Bergson is a kind of limit experience. It's at the limits of what we're capable of experiencing. A pure perception for Bergson would involve no memory whatsoever. It would be, you could say, the differential or the fluxus approach to reality, that every moment is completely unique and is fluxing, changing. It's stepping out of itself. It's already different than whatever we think it is, right? And there's no way to say anything coherently about it, because words refer to things that are the same in different instances. Like, this is a red book and a red cup, or this person is sad and that person is sad.
Because you couldn't even have form without memory, really, could you?
Yeah, exactly. It would be a formless, it would still have like qualitative differences, but they would be pure differences of flux and change and transience, if you will. Now, on the other hand, we have another sort of limit experience, which he calls pure memory. And in pure memory, so he says basically, if you want to understand pure memory, think about like a near-death experience where somebody has a past life review. And these were really big at the time. A book had come out right before he wrote Matter and Memory about this. And in a sense, your entire past is with you right now. You're not capable of having an image, let's say, of your whole past. Now, you can, in a way, feel the weight of it. Like he describes it as like the stars in the night sky. There's, and our stars suck now because of light pollution and all of Elon Musk's little things up in the sky. But back then, it was very vivid, and there were, innumerable stars that were just overwhelming, right? That's the way he sees our memory. So we have all of these past moments, and we shouldn't think of them again as a line, but think of them as virtual, which means sort of a nebula of all of these moments, each one singular in its own way, existing in its own way.
As they exist in the present, as the past exists, not exactly.
I wouldn't say in the present, because when we say in the present, we're somehow bringing that past to the present and relating it to the present.
Okay.
So Bergson is what we might call a realist when it comes to the past. He thinks that the past exists. And then the question is like, where does the past exist? And he's like, this is exactly what we're doing
Yeah,
wrong.
the point.
We're
Yeah.
thinking that it exists in a present,
Yeah.
or that it's contained even. But he says it exists in itself. That's not a very helpful phrase, but maybe it points us in the right direction. But the past is irrevocable, we could say. This is a line that Whitehead, it's irreversible. It's irrevocable. It cannot be otherwise than having happened, right? Whatever it was, we can't say, exactly what it was because it's ineffable. Every moment is unique. It's this pure perception, if you will, this becoming that can't have a label put to it. And the pure past is the accumulation of all past events. And this reality is, in a sense, for Bergson, our spiritual reality. And we, in dreams, we access this virtual past. I mean, in a way, you can think of like, I have a certain memory of some moment in my childhood. From the present, I've coded it like, oh, that's the moment that I then became, I don't know, something that determined my future and how I understand myself today. But if you went back to that moment, there would be a lot of details that would be irrelevant to that narrative that I've created about how that event determines who I am. So the virtual past, or the pure past, the past in its infinitude and inexhaustible detail, will always be more than what we can make sense of it. It's always something greater than our sort of finite way of conveying it into the present. And he actually says that between the becoming of the present, which again is ineffable and has an infinity of details, and the past, which is different than the present, like there's no present as it's existing in the past, right?
Yeah.
Because every moment is new. But there's a relation there between two infinities. And he says our consciousness is our way of integrating them, our way of bringing the becoming of the present and our entire infinite past into conversation and making sense of it.
This is incredible, Jack. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's just so pregnant with esoteric significance and on so many levels, cosmology, spiritual evolution of consciousness. And we absolutely don't have time to get into any of it. So we'll have to have you back sometime. That's
Sure,
a different discussion than what we're doing today. We'll have to have you back sometime and engage in that, because it's just incredible. I mean, you just see so much light being thrown between the two in these relationships. But because we're sort of actually already running out of time, we also need to have you back on for longer as well. I just wanted to transition into CIIS. That's all right with you?
Sure. Yeah.
And so could you just, I mean, CIIS, to my understanding, they've been around for many decades, mid was it 60s or 70s? I don't have the date in front.
Exactly. And it was at first called I might get the name wrong, but the Institute of East and West
Studies or something.
East-West Studies. Yeah, I think that's right. And like
yeah.
Alan Watts was involved in the early period and things like that.
Yeah. So
I shall also say there's a lineage that goes back to Haridas Chaudhuri and Sri Aurobindo as well.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah.
In the formation of the school, but it was really like a cross-cultural, cross-dialogue institute from the start.
Okay, great. I mean, that's what I wanted you to speak about. Maybe rather than the history, because we are short on time, just more about what you all are doing today in that regard, in terms of bridging East-West in the field of, I mean, it's a very, very, I know it's been probably an uphill battle because you all are an accredited philosophical, PhD you offer, and that today that's not maybe that big a deal, but it wasn't that long ago it was a very big deal to have these ideas in an accredited university. So
definitely,
maybe you could tell us a bit about the work you're doing today, having had this legacy behind you guys. What that means.
Yeah. I mean, I find I went to Boston College, which is very much in the continental tradition of philosophy. I mean, it's a pluralistic department on the whole, but like it's like in the academy. and so going to CIIS was definitely a big shift that way. It's an outlier within the but actually a lot of the professors at BC when I got the job had heard of it and were thrilled about it and thought that Rick Tarnas and these people were doing great work, and I was like, I haven't even heard of this place. But when I read the description, I was like, this job is made for me.
Yeah.
And I'm like meant to be at CIIS and be a part of this program. And so I joined 4 years ago, and I still feel that way. And I absolutely love the program. It is definitely has its abnormalities to it. A lot of our students are returning students, so older students. Like at Boston College, the average PhD student was fresh out of a master's or undergrad. A couple people were maybe in their 30s, but like we have a lot of returning students, people who have careers already and want to do a master's or a PhD and are returning to school. Yeah, I mean the name itself of our department, I feel like says so much. The philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. I always mess the order up because I'm dyslexic, but I think that that's the the right order. Even when I read that, when I hadn't heard of the school, I was like, oh shit, like this subtle shift in focus already says a lot. That philosophy should be considered alongside these other studies, and that these studies are really facets of the same question.
Mhm.
Let's
you-
see. I mean, or I don't know if you have a follow up.
I was sort of following up on that train of thought. Like, so do you see CIS playing, sort of thinking back to our thinkers today as well, of taking what is generally what is essentially an intellectual discipline into the realm of lived experience, and how is that significant for the work that people, the actual practice of philosophy, which is the whole point of getting a PhD,
Yeah. Well, here, I mean, the two philosophers that I would most, I mean, I think Bergson has many resources to think about this, but Nishida really hits this and predates the other person I was going to say, which is Merleau-Ponty. And these are like, and Merleau-Ponty I'm teaching right now. He's one of the reasons I got the job, I think, in CIIS. Really Bergson and Merleau-Ponty, they saw as doing exactly what our department is talking about and trying to do, but there wasn't anyone teaching these figures. So there's been a kind of surge in that interest. I think before that, you can think of Whitehead as really being the central figure of the department. And I think that these are very complementary thinkers. But for Nishida, he goes in the direction. So he calls it like active intuition. So he gets this idea from Bergson of intuition. And intuition is to see things through their durational reality. We could say their integral reality rather than through derivative or through snapshots and concepts and generalities. Instead, seeing it in its singularity, in its becoming, in its duration. So Nishida takes that and says intuitions are really active intuitions or acting intuitions. And Bergson already has this idea to some degree. I think Nishida does a really great job of pinpointing it and bringing it to the surface. And it's kind of something muddy in Bergson. And he looks at the Zen arts and the way that you not only sort of enter a flow state that draws on your entire spiritual being. Like we can think of this idea of the virtual past, like the whole concrete person that you are with all of your memories, not channeled through one narrative, not coded through certain symbols and identities and things like that, but the multiplicity and what is potential there, right? Virtual has this sense of potentiality. So acting intuition is at the same time acting and experiencing and inventing. There's a cybernetic element here. I mean, not in the sort of reductive cybernetics, but cybernetics comes from the Greek word to guide, like a ship. Cybernetic is the piloting of the ship, and so you make a change mid course, and you see what it does, and then you adjust, and you do this in a flow state, so that you're constantly adjusting, but also abiding in some kind of structure, right? This is the idea of like a formless form that we find, and this idea of like non-action in Zen and in Taoism.
So to CIAS, I'm just thinking of like
Mhm.
what this all means for like the study and practice of philosophy. And I just think of it, not to get into but and I sort of an idea or image of what those students are looking like. And I'm just seeing them like taking these concepts like as groups and these sort of more mature people that are coming in
Mhm.
to the program with these like all these experiences, all
Mhm.
this rich source of memory behind them. And I can imagine this incredibly dynamic,
Mhm.
creative atmosphere in
It
these
is.
classrooms and in the work you guys are doing. And so I think, do you see maybe as like a closing comment or whatever, like the the movement of this sort of doing of philosophy or of making a philosophy as a group endeavor,
Mhm.
you know, because always philosophy, we look at individuals and their thoughts.
Mhm.
And of course, you sort of have to do that to some degree. But do you see philosophy moving into sort of a more of a group paradigm? And do you see any evidence of that in your classrooms? Your
Definitely. And I think that this kind of cross what did I call it before? Confirmation between different traditions. The
Yeah.
fact that you can go through Merleau-Ponty or Bergson or Nishida or Sri Aurobindo or Whitehead, and there's others besides that, even Wittgenstein or and even indigenous philosophical
Mhm.
traditions, and come to ideas about the self and consciousness and pure experience, and sort of cross-check them and learn through that multiplicity. I mean, I even think like this idea came to me earlier that Bergson has all these beautiful metaphors, and then when you read them, if you just reproduce the metaphor, it's almost as if you didn't get it, because the
Yeah.
purpose is that you're supposed to come up with new metaphors and go beyond. So I think that that's a huge move, and something we really foster in PCC and in our department is it's not just about doing sort of clerical work on history of philosophy. And this is something that, again, like Nishida was sort of criticized for, and Hagaki, who I mentioned, I think to you earlier. I don't know if I mentioned but Tatsuya Hagaki, who's a current Nishida and Bergson and Deleuze scholar, he says Nishida was like a child playing with toys, and the toys were like the absolute from Hegel and like these big notions. But he's like, actually, this is great because
Yeah.
he was able to do something naive and create like new knowledge, new ways of thinking. Um, there's a sort of creative moment in the history of philosophy that I think is essential. Now, of course, we do want to do good scholarship. We do want to be historical. But if that's all you do, then you lose the purpose. Like, it's a living thing. Like, philosophy is a living thing. And if we treat it as already constituted masses that we're supposed to just like arrange properly, we're not doing philosophy anymore. We're really called upon to create and be alive in that project. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jack. This has
Yeah.
been
Thank you.
what I would love to keep going, but thank you, thank you, thank you. You have
Yeah.
illumined all of our minds and filled our hearts with joy, and we
Thank you.
cannot be enough gratitude for this. It's
That's
really
very sweet.
incredible. And so we look forward to bringing you back on for the panel
Perfect.
later. But now actually I'm going to turn it over to Steve Nation and to Jay McDaniel. Hi, Steve. Steve, you are muted, I think.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes, very good.
That, wow, it's interesting following that, and it's going to be very interesting, Jay, to hear insights on process, because to me, we've come to a stage where we're seeing something wholly creative and new, almost related to life itself, taking those Zen, the Shida, and the Bergson's intuition ideas, that something wholly new and creative is emerging in consciousness. And we're trying to look at that through the eyes of this relationship between East and West, and particularly the Oriental East. I mean, from our esoteric traditions and many Western traditions, we're very familiar, or we're more familiar perhaps with Indian Eastern thought that's come from India, and perhaps not so familiar with something not wholly different, but something certainly different from China, Japan, from the Orient. And so that's what we're looking at. So, welcome, friends. In a way, this idea of an emerging new consciousness is trying to look at the present and to see a whole new wave coming into thought, but also that we can expect to come into every field of human life, every profession, and into the relationship between nations. So that's politics, diplomacy, but essentially culture. And we're looking at culture as being environments of thought that are creatively, purposefully, and actively thinking through deep questions concerning right expression of love, freedom, truth, beauty, justice in communities, nations, and peoples, and particularly in response to the challenges and circumstances of this time we're in history. And so it was interesting for me listening to Jack and Michael, this idea of a new spirit coming through with Bergson that relates to Blavatsky, to and of course to Teilhard de Chardin, Sri Aurobindo, and in a sense, for me, and certainly Alice Bailey for us from our context, and in a sense, part of that would seem to be an evolutionary perspective, some perspective on evolution. And clearly, a key part of the philosophy of this new approach that came through from sort of the turn of the century to the mid 20th century is encapsulated in Whitehead and process philosophy, and an extraordinary alignment to me. I mean, the first time I discovered it, I couldn't believe it, that this Western philosophy had a natural, organic relationship with philosophers in China that spread right through Chinese academic institutions and is now a well-established field of thought in China. Jay, it's an honor to have you with us, and I sort of, when we reached out to you, we thought, well, we're not likely, these probably won't respond. This is a cold call. Why the hell would a man? And when you finally got the email, when we managed to contact, your instant response was so positive, and I just want to say we're so grateful to you for agreeing to speak with us. You're the board chair of the Center for Process Studies, which is the main sort of center of the inheritor of Whitehead's thought, particularly as it lives today. Right. A retired professor of religious studies at Hendrix College in Arkansas, and a leading thinker in the field of process philosophy, integral Christian thought, Zen Buddhism, and Confucian studies, among others. You've written, it's interesting, the books that you've written, Jay, they include With Roots and Wings, Christianity in an Age of Ecology and Dialogue, Living from the Center, Spirituality in an Age of Consumerism, and Gandhi's Hope, Learning from Other Religions as a Path to Peace. And Jay, you're going to talk to us a little initially, and then we'll sort of get into a conversation. Jay has intimately close experience in the whole field of process philosophy and process theology's development in China. So he has very close links with China, and we really value that as we build a thought form in this seminar. So over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Steve. And it's great to be with everyone here. Thanks for being here. And Christine, thank you very much for your introductory talk. It was extremely helpful, and it made me realize I think I'm at the right place. Because I too am interested in the world's future and in ways of thinking and feeling that can contribute in constructive ways to a healthy future. And I too, like you, think that the relations between East and West are critical. And yes, it's time for the West to learn from the East. Enough of our Western parochialism. Jack's interest in Nishida is illustrative of a kind of turning in philosophy. I've done that turning as well. My PhD dissertation long ago was on Whitehead and the Kyoto School of Japanese Buddhism. And so I did a little study of Nishida and I knew Nishitani. And I was the English teacher for a Zen Buddhist priest from Japan while I was in school in Claremont. So Zen Buddhism in particular, which shaped Nishida, means a lot to me. But on to Whitehead and China. Steve is right. I do have a fairly intimate understanding of how the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead is now influencing China. And I'm going to presuppose that most of you know little, if anything about Whitehead. I'm not sure why you should.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me say a brief note about who Whitehead was and a couple of his core ideas, and then turn to why Chinese are interested in Whitehead and how that happened, and what in particular interests them about Whitehead's philosophy. So Whitehead was a mathematician and a philosopher who moved to Harvard later in his life and developed a whole philosophy that he did not call process philosophy. He called it the philosophy of organism. And it was articulated in a couple of books, but one of them was called Science and the Modern World, and that was a critique of scientific materialism. And a second one was called Process and Reality, and people tend to think that that's kind of the most systematic articulation of his perspective. And a third was called Adventures of Ideas. And in those three books, he developed an outlook on life that came to be called process philosophy. I'll tell you some of the key ideas in it. One you would have heard from Jack already. It's that life is a process of becoming, and there is a sense in which becoming precedes being, because nothing has existence without having come into existence. So the process of becoming a being is at the heart of what it means to be a being, whatever that is. And by being here, I don't mean anything special. I have in mind dogs and cats and people and stars and paramecia and quantum events and the depths of atoms and molecules. Whitehead thought there was a multi-dimensional universe. There wasn't just the three-dimensional universe. So there may well be forms of existence, beings, and other dimensions of existence too. But all of them would include within their very constitution, their very nature, the activity of becoming. So that's one idea in process thought. Another idea is that there's no such thing as dead matter. So we can divide the world into what we call living matter, biological matter, in this case, people, other animals, plants, and dead matter. And we might think of mountains as a form of dead matter. And maybe we all realize that matter actually there's liquid matter and gaseous matter and plasma matter. Matter is not just solid matter. But Whitehead's view was that there's something like a kind of aliveness, a kind of spontaneity an energy in all matter, such that there's not really any dead matter. There are just various forms of living matter. I'm a form of that, but a molecule is a form of that. So wherever there is energy of any kind, any sort, he thought there's something like, he didn't use the word consciousness, but something like feeling. His word was prehending, not apprehending, but prehending. And consciousness is a kind of feeling, a kind of prehending, but there's more to prehending than consciousness. So that's a second idea. We live on a living earth, indeed, a living universe. A third idea in Whitehead concerns value. So, what is value? Well, the word can mean many different things. But sometimes when we use the word value, we have something very specific in mind. When I look at Steve, and I'll look at him at this very moment on this screen, I know that he matters to himself. You're not simply an object for me. You also matter to yourself. You're not exactly an object for yourself, but you're the subject of your own life. And as a subject of your own life, you have what Whitehead calls self-enjoyment, or a concern for your own existence. And Whiteheadians speak of that as intrinsic value. It's not an instrumental value. It's not what Steve does for me. It's Steve's own life involves intrinsic value. And that means there's something to respect there. I can't just treat another person as an object. Another person is a subject. But so is another animal. Indeed, so is a living cell. Indeed, if you go all the way down into the depths of matter, where there's energy, Whitehead thought there was something even like the realization of value there. So a third idea is that it would be good for us to live with respect and care for life wherever we find it, and particularly the highly sentient forms of life, where we know they suffer. So I think I've talked about process and intrinsic value. Here's another. It's possible to look at the world as if it consists of mutually independent billiard balls, things that exist in isolation from one another. First they exist and then they interact. Whitehead didn't think so. He thought that we emerge out of our interactions, that our relations with one another form part of who and what we are. As Christine was saying, we are our freedom, whatever it is, our capacity for decision, for choice, for liberty. It always emerges out of relations. It's never atomized. We're not individual captains of our ship who then interact with the rest of the world. There are no captains except as emerging out of relationships. Whitehead went further. He said, if we think in terms of wholes and parts, we might say, oh yes, all parts are parts of wholes. True. A mitochondrium is part of a living cell. But he also said that all parts are themselves wholes. So, in a way, every moment, this moment, carries inside it the whole rest of the universe. The many of the universe are present in the oneness of the moment. Now, you remember William Blake, perhaps the Western poet, who said, to be enlightened is to see the universe in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. It's not that the wildflower is part of heaven, it's that heaven's in the wildflower. And it's not that the grain of sand is just part of a bigger universe. The universe is in that grain of sand. For Whitehead, every moment is that grain of sand. So this moment, in this moment, it's what he called a concrescence of the universe, a becoming concrete of the universe in the moment at issue. We could, I'll mention one more, two more, and then I'll get to China. By the way, that last idea you can call interconnectedness, but it's not just impact. It's that things are really parts of one another, and wholes are actually in parts. It's a deep form of interconnectedness. If you know a little Buddhism, it's like Huayan Buddhism in China, the Chinese tradition of Huayan Buddhism. It's similar to that. Two more ideas, then to China. Whitehead believed that the universe is inside a larger life, and he named that larger life God. And so you can think of this larger life inside of which the universe lives and moves and has its being, um, as having its own life in a way. Now, he had a fairly sophisticated way of thinking about God, and God had different natures, and all that's worthy of discussion. But just the notion that there is a cosmic soul, that we're somehow part of something more than us, that's a cosmic soul, and one way that soul is also inside each of us at every moment is as an inwardly felt lure, Lure, like a magnet inside each person, beckoning, beckoning us first simply to live, but then as best we can to live in terms of truth and goodness and beauty. Now, goodness means what it sounds like, compassion. And truth means what it sounds like, openness to wisdom wherever found. And beauty also means what it sounds like. Beauty isn't just prettiness, it's richness of experience. It's richness of experience in relation to ourselves and the world. So there is inside of us the world soul as that lure. Okay. Last idea, there's a social aspiration here, and this is big for many people today, and it comes from China. So what are we beckoned toward today at this historical juncture? This is where Whiteheadians, influenced by China, by the way, speak of the possibility, the aspirational ideal of an ecological civilization. And that's a civilization where people live with respect and care for one another and respect and care for the community of life. It's a different environment of thought, you might say, Steve. You know, it has many precedents. Indigenous traditions certainly have a strong taste of this. Early Christianity certainly had a strong taste of this. Um, Aspects of original Islam had a strong taste of this. I don't want to say this is absolutely new, but this is our moment to help bring about that kind of better world that's ecologically integrated as well as socially integrated. All right. Now imagine that you live in China, and this is true. This is a true story. I'm speaking of an actual person. His name is Zhihao Wang, Wang. First name Zhihe. Imagine you are the editor of the Journal of Sociology in mainland China around the year 1995. And you have a PhD in sociology, and they've asked you to receive books from around the world that you can review in the Journal for Sociology of China, the main journal. And so you get all these books from different locations, and you get one, and it's called something like Toward a Postmodern Science. And the subtitle says Linking Science and Spirituality, something like that. And the editor is a man named David Ray Griffin. who's a process philosopher. And, and in the book, in the preface to the book, Griffin says that Whitehead's philosophy can serve as a bridge between science and spirituality, as a bridge between East and West, as a bridge into a healthier future. And you read that, and you read more about the philosophy, and you think to yourself, you know, a lot of this sounds like part of our own tradition. The aliveness of nature, living ecologically, the relational self, the whole and the part as well as the part and the whole. Everything is in process, is becoming. That sounds like Taoism. That sounds like Confucianism at its best. That sounds like Buddhism. That sounds like Chinese folk traditions. You think to yourself, maybe so. Maybe this philosophy can be a bridge by which we Chinese can claim the depths of our own heritage without denying science, and in a rational way that nonetheless includes attention to feeling, and that can help us move toward a more ecological future where we have clean water, clean air, good food, healthy relations with the environment, rather than what we now have. So who knows, maybe Whitehead's a bridge to the future and a bridge between East and West. So this man, and I'm really talking about a real person, he decided to go to Claremont, California and get a PhD in process philosophy, which he did. And his dissertation, interestingly enough, was on interreligious dialogue in a process perspective. And he had a name for it. He called it harmonism. Harmonism. All right. The rest is history. He convinced people in Claremont, which was then a center for process philosophy. He said, I'm going to go back to China and let's have the next International Whitehead Conference in Beijing. And they did. And let's see if we can set up some centers for research into Whitehead's philosophy at various universities and colleges. And they did. They set up 30 centers. And let's take some people from the West over to China to lead workshops to introduce academics and students and grad students to Whitehead's philosophy. We'll have an annual summer workshop on Whitehead's philosophy. And they did. And I myself taught the first ones. I was the person that went to lead those workshops in China on Whitehead. That's been going on since about the year 2000. And so now, today, yes, Whitehead's philosophy is a live option in China. Now, it's not always called Whitehead's philosophy. Sometimes it's called constructive postmodernism. Constructive postmodernism. It's not exactly Derrida. It's not exactly deconstructing things, but it's reconstructing things in a new way that builds upon the best of science, but also the best of spirituality. So it goes constructive postmodernism, process philosophy. Sometimes they just call it Whitehead. Now I'm going to say one more thing, Steve, and I'll stop, and then we'll have a little give and take. There's the question of Karl Marx. You cannot be in China today and say something blasphemous against Marx. There is a sense in which you must find value in Marx, and you're encouraged to think that Marx, in a way, helped save your nation. Marx helped save your nation from a kind of feudalism and a kind of class hierarchy and a kind of stagnation that had you in pretty dire straits. And thank the world's soul for Karl Marx.
Mhm.
So when you have process philosophy there, you do not say it's process philosophy or Karl Marx.
Mm.
You say process philosophy and the best of Karl Marx. And my teacher, John Cobb, who I studied with, he once joked, he said, I think in 30 years, maybe 50 years, Whitehead will be the dominant philosophy of mainland China, and they'll call it Marxism. Because Marxism is in process too. There's nothing much that's not in process. So maybe that gives us something to talk about, Steve.
No, I think so. That's a fabulous overview and introduction. You know, from our perspective, from the esoteric perspective, what I'm hearing is actually the most beautiful, in the sense of beauty that you mentioned it, in terms of beauty of thought, but also beauty of the reality of
Mhm,
the present and the reality of the human experience,
mhm.
of this Buddhist idea of right relationships, that we are actually facing an initiatory
Yeah.
from a theosophical sense, and collectively and individually, an initiatory crisis in consciousness, where we are forced, where the lure
Mhm.
of this idea of everything being interdependent and in relationship is pulling us into something new, because we've, like, ecological consciousness has been an idea which has had enormous impact in every profession, like
Mhm.
medicine. Just think about medicine, how medicine now looks much more, allopathy looks much more at the whole person than ever in the entire history, where it just looked dissected, dissected, dissected. Now it's much more about relationships between parts and
Yeah.
wholes. But the deeper sense of that, um, and the role that it's almost as if symbolically the relationship between China and the West symbolizes this only path through consumerism and materialism, which is destroying our planet, which is destroying us spiritually, and of course destroying all of the kingdoms of nature. So this relationship between China and the West, in a way, symbolizes a doorway through which we have no choice but to pass. Seems.
You know that I I just agree with you, Steve. I I just agree. Um, I want to say just a word about relationship.
Mm.
A lot of people champion the process perspective, and they do the same with Buddhism and other traditions, as emphasizing relationality. So that word relationality is now kind of a buzzword. Oh, I'm for relationality. You're for relationality. And the flip side of that coin is, rather than hyper individualism. So you've got a relational orientation over here versus individualism over here, which is a bad thing. You know?
Yeah.
When I taught in China, what I discovered, and this is a little Confucianism here, of course, many Chinese grow up to think in terms of being part of a larger society, part of a larger whole, and with responsibilities to family, to nation. But they can sometimes find that kind of relationality suffocating
Hmm.
because it does not leave space for individual creativity
Hmm.
and individual difference. So I quickly learned to distinguish between healthy relationality,
Hmm.
which leaves room, space for healthy individuality,
Hmm.
as distinct from unhealthy relationality, which is suffocating or oppressive and snuffs out the creativity. Now, Steve, that's not exactly our problem over here. We're so individualistic that we need a good dose, it seems to me, in the West of relational thinking. But the ultimate ideal is a kind of coalescence of, of a sense of personhood, individual personhood, as emerging out of with responsibility to an eco-social context.
No, exactly. And the it was interesting because the seminar that preceded this in London was a beautiful event. Well, I don't know if you know Kerry Brown, who's a professor of Chinese studies and a theologian. But Kerry in particular spoke about this sort of dilemma facing both China in relation to what you're saying of the relationship between creativity in the individual and the
Yeah.
Chinese sense of the civilization.
Hmm.
And certainly in the West, it's obviously a crisis. And the West has no, like, for so long, we've lived with ideals about freedom that are hugely challenged by where that freedom has led us to. In other words, the environmental crisis, but also the crisis of the gap between wealth and poverty, the inability to apply the supposed ideals at the heart of Western civilization to any sense of livingness, of human expression.
Yeah, yeah.
So in a way, both, it seems to me, both China and the West are challenged with these crises. And I was interested, Jack mentioned, and maybe in the comment later, he mentioned Bergson talking about tension.
Hmm.
And an esoteric thought, there's a lot of
Hmm.
focus on right tension. In other
Oh,
words,
really?
not
Oh,
stress, because we think of tension as
really?
stress. And when we look at the spiritual crisis, particularly in the West, it's clearly a crisis of enormous stress because this lure
Hmm.
has been, we now in such an overstimulated way have turned our backs on the lure
Hmm.
to love
Hmm.
and truth, duty, and goodness.
Hmm. Hmm.
And yet the depth of that stress has also produced the birth of a point of spiritual tension where thought and mind is truly, for the first time almost, exploring what the hell is real. So what is good, what is beauty, and what is true. And that's what almost what everything had to build up to this. um, and it's encapsulated by this relationship around freedom between China and the West, I, I,
Yeah.
I think, and however long that's going to take to play out.
Uh, uh, I see some comments
Oh,
with
yeah,
regard
thank
to
you.
religion and the practice of religion. And I'd like to say a word about that. But first, Steve, do I get you right that the esoteric tradition or the Alice Bailey tradition talks about right tension?
Yes, it's
Well,
the
that
heart of that sort of heart of meditation is about building right tension.
No, that's a marvelous idea. That's
between
good.
between different layers of mind.
Interesting.
And particularly if you look at the lure idea, as the mind begins to ponder and simply be present to the lure, you can trace it. Tension is a good way of tracing what happens to the mind. And then that
Interesting.
reaches into intuition. Anyway, that's
I want to add just a tangential note here, but then we'll talk about religion.
yeah.
In Whitehead's philosophy, in Process and Reality, he proposes that at every moment of our life, what we're actually seeking is intensity, our, our,
Yeah.
our vitality of experience,
Mhm.
the first form of which is simply to be alive. But then there are higher forms of vitality. And he added the word harmony to that. So he said intensities which are harmonious are more desirable, more satisfying than intensities which are not. But built into the notion of intensity, we're digging into the weeds here.
Yeah, no, this is lovely.
He also said intensity involves contrast.
Yes.
And that was the word he used. And so intensity needs a juxtaposition of different things, and they may not be obviously reconcilable, but nonetheless, they can coexist in a kind of satisfying intensity. So when I went to China later in his life, Whitehead tended to use the word harmony more than intensity. In Adventures of Ideas, so most Whiteheadians say harmony and intensity, good enough. But in China, they would say, but harmony cannot mean sameness. That in our culture, sometimes if people talk about, let's have a harmonious society or a harmonious future, they actually may have in mind sameness, Sameness, sameness. That's not the harmony we're interested in, not harmony as sameness. It's a more vital, creative harmony, they would say. And I think they could have said it's a harmony that includes constructive tensions. That's why I like that phrase so much. Um,
It's,
constructive tensions.
yeah, this is a time to have a break, which is because I'd love to go on with this, just because in esoteric thinking, in the Bailey tradition, the way in which humanity evolves is through a pattern of harmony through conflict.
Oh, really?
In other words, that the value of conflict is that it leads to ever higher points of harmony, or in other words, points of creative tension. And intensity, I was thinking, listening to you speak about intensity is so beautiful because it's also to do with form and formlessness. A
Mm,
form-based intensity
mm,
is perhaps unhealthy,
mm,
because it's overstimulated. But an intensity that is at a higher point of tension
mm,
is the essence of, in our philosophy, we would say it is the essence of invocation. In other words, it's the essence of calling the
mm.
lure,
Yeah,
calling the lure down. Um,
really. Yeah. I love that word
um,
invocation.
it's the heart of, Catherine's got it, it's the heart of,
Yeah,
really,
it's
the
a
heart of our work, and it's something like, even something like a seminar. I mean, the way in which it's designed is that we envisage it
mhm.
as a building of a thought form that invokes,
That's
and
nice
then
because it's I think it's non-coercive. I
yeah,
think
yeah,
it carries within it the notion of a cooperation of some kind, a cooperative spirit. Listen, if we need a break, we need a
yeah,
break.
we
I do hope we can say a word about religion in China. Just
please,
no, sometime we can do it after the break, maybe.
yeah, please. Okay, so thank you, Jay. Thank you so much.
You're
Bless you.
welcome. You're
And we'll be back. We have a break for 10 minutes. Michael, is there anything you need to? You're the boss here.
No, that's all. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jay. And we'll get to that religion question as soon as we come back. We're just going to take a quick break, just to
Okay.
split up it's about the middle point. So let's take a quick break and come back for the rest of the seminar and the panel afterward. But as we go on the break, I wanted to make just a brief announcement. Some of our um, sort of a world goodwill announcement, which actually has to do exactly with the note you ended on, Jay and Steve, about invocation.
Mm.
So the Lucis Trust is the distributor of a great mantra, or you could say prayer, called the Great Invocation.
Mm.
And this invocation is essentially a tool used to invoke higher spiritual energies. It's a very effective tool. It's very simple to use. And we have recently created a new website focusing on the Great Invocation. We'll type it in the chat shortly. So we just wanted to let everybody know about this new website, about the Great Invocation, and to encourage everybody who is interested to use it. And if you want to know more, the best way is really just to go to the website and you can read about it there. Those of you that are sort of familiar with our work will also know about the triangles activity, which is based upon group use of the Great Invocation. This, through meditation, this establishing of a network of lighted triangles throughout the world. So this is a very simple practice, which can be done at any time. And so we invite you also to, if you're interested in this spiritual practice, which is related to the Great Invocation, please, you can type your name in the chat box. We'll reach out to you. You can also visit www.triangles.org and learn more about it there. And there also is, of course, a webinar on the second Monday of every month, and we'll put the links to that in the chat as well. So thank you all. Enjoy your break, and we'll be back around 3:55, between 3:55 and 4 p.m. Eastern. That's Eastern Standard Time. So we'll going to transition now into our panel. So if Jack and Jay and Catherine, if you guys want to come on, and then I'll pass it over to Steve. We'll get us started.
So, okay, here we are. Beautiful. So I think this has been a very rich whole sort of afternoon, really, discussion, because it's bringing together deep ideas, but from traditions that many of us are not familiar with. So to start with, but Jay, let's just finish this. Some thoughts about religion in China, and then we might. What might be interesting following those comments would be to hear from Jack and Catherine, if you have any responses to that, and then we can move into see where we go. Jay.
Yeah, I realize that this is a panel, and so this is a bit of a follow-up from the last session. So I'll try just to be very brief. It will just be interesting for you to know that Whitehead in China typically does not include talk about religion, and it does not include talk about Whitehead's understanding of God. So there's a whole lot in Whitehead that you can use and talk about without necessarily referring to God, the cosmic soul that I speak of, or religion. And that's because religion has been a source of such division in China historically. And, the agenda, like Christine was saying, is social harmony. So just for your information, now, on the other hand, you're very free to talk about spirituality. uh, and you're very free to talk about meditation. And you're very free to talk about Taoism and the sense of a kind of deep cosmic flow through things. And you're very free to talk about chi energy. There's all kinds of things you can talk about vis-a-vis spirituality, but organized religion is a bit questionable, especially Abrahamic traditions, especially from the West,
Yeah.
especially Christianity and Islam. So that's just for the record. Nothing further to say there unless there are questions, but just let that be known.
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. I mean, maybe in the discussion, because I'd be interested to hear how that relates to the question of heaven, which seems to me to be a Confucian concept also, like the heavenly worlds, the immortals. Jack, there's a question in the panel that came up earlier from Matthew Martin about Henry Bergson and the élan vital, the sort of vital body, which from sort of Blavatsky's tradition and the Alice Bailey tradition, there's a sort of lot of interest in this idea of the energy bodies and the energy, the subtle energy aspect of form, actually, of all form. So I wondered if you could be interesting to hear something about Bergson's view of the élan vital. I don't know whether my pronunciation is
Your pronunciation's all right.
Well,
Sure, I would love to. And I could also say a bit on the whole tension question that came up earlier, because I love that thread. But so let me say a couple things about the élan vital first, and then I'll go to the tension question. But one misconception with the élan vital is that it's a vitalism, which posits a unprovable principle that cannot be in any way perceived or conceived, or that is this kind of immaterial principle ad hoc taken into a system in order to solve a problem. Bergson, first of all, criticizes vitalisms, especially what he considers two related problems. One, preformism, and the other one would be sort of the Aristotelian lack of evolution within natural forms, that natural forms have this already existing entelechy or program or programming that they just fulfill. The Elan Vital is, well, first of all, part of our most intimate self-awareness of our experience. So it's certainly not something that is far off from anything we could experience or understand. He thinks that there are many sort of experiments we can do in our own experience that aliven a sense of the Elan Vital. I really like this image of, Elan in French is kind of names the moment. If you're going to jump into a pool, swimming pool or something like that, you have this tension in you that, oh, I want to jump in. I have this urge, but I'm also like hesitating and like don't want to get cold or whatever. What happens when you jump in the water? This moment before you jump, this readiness, kind of compression of a spring, a feeling of real potentiality, to use a phrase from Whitehead. So the Elan Vital is a name for this creative, active and yet passive, almost like a hesitation. The word hesitation is really big for Bergson, that in this moment of hesitation where we feel our potential to act, creativity comes in. And again, duration is the key for Bergson. And in our duration, in this hesitating moment, this interval between action and reaction within the sensory experience, where memory comes in, creativity comes in, invention comes in. I could say more on that, but I also want to speak to the long tradition of the idea of tension that Bergson draws on, which goes back to Heraclitus, the idea of productive tension, creative tension, Heraclitus loves these polarities that can't be completely pulled apart, and his images of the bow and the lyre. And the bow is, of course, the not the violin bow, but the archery bow. And this exact same image we get, and comparison, contrast, if you will, intensity, comes in Taoism, in the Tao Te Ching, with the bow and the lyre as well. And this idea of a harmony that is not too harmonious as to destroy the difference, and not too discordant so as to no longer have what we might say like an increase in intensity greater than the sum of the parts, or a constructive tension, right? And I think the key with the constructive tension is that it remains unresolved, right? And for Nishida, for example, the tension between action and passivity, for example, or of a flow state where we lose a sense of self, where we lose a sense of agency and acting, keeping that in tension with action and knowledge, and even between logic and the irrational. Nishida has been criticized for being too poetic. If you go read Nishida, almost everyone will be like, this is too logical. It's way too dry and logical. I mean, same thing goes with Whitehead in some sense. And I think that productive tension is what's brilliant in these thinkers. And then I would also just point to the Stoics, for whom tension was an ontological category. So everything was a degree of tension. And tension was understood through effort. So when we make an effort, there's a kind of force behind it, and there's a resistance to that force, and there's an overcoming and a development, both of the force and the resistance, right? And understanding all reality as a kind of tension is understanding it as a kind of effort and a kind of spiritual activity. Yeah, I mean, I could go on more about that, but I really do think that the tension piece is central to the process perspective, whether Bergson or Whitehead or Nishida.
Just to add a comment, Jay, what's beautiful about what you just shared is I don't think that's either, to me at least, it's neither a Eastern nor a Western concept. It's just equally both of them. Like I don't even,
Yeah.
I was sort of thinking of a question, okay, how do we draw that back to East and West? Well, there's no need to because
Mhm.
it's exactly both,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And in a way, I mean, the whole idea of really the idea behind having this event and with its three phases, and and we forget that a whole thing happened in Geneva and then in London and now here, is in a sense to be observing a state of tension building in the collective consciousness, and a state of actually creative tension with definition, clarity, and beauty, and in a sense, what we would see ourselves and what we would see you doing, Jack, at CIIS, and Jay, what in all of the circles of affiliation, the process groups that you're involved with, are contributing to this building of a point of tension in human thought. And from the esoteric perspective, thought, these fields of thought, are almost looked at as form because they're causal. And so in the esoteric work, all the training and meditation and everything is almost about seeking to train a way of intuitively observing, and of course always getting messed up and losing ourselves in glamours and illusions, but seeking to observe the building of a point of tension in human evolution, that can take us through to something that is encapsulated by these Eastern Western ideas, harmony, and also rationality, the relationship between rationality and the intuition, I suppose, the experience of life itself, partly through ecology, but of course much wider, true ecology, which is involves everything.
I have a question about the aspirational ideal of the arcane tradition. And what is behind this is the dialogue between Teilhard de Chardin and Whitehead. Um, both thinkers. By the way, Teilhard can be considered a process thinker, so I don't mean to say, well, I actually think he is. But Teilhard believed that evolution is on its way toward a state where love will be all in all. And he called that Omega. And everything is on its way toward that love being all in all. And that could suggest that tension, creative tension, is actually ultimately to be eliminated. It could suggest that in a kind of harmony of harmonies where there's no more tension. Whitehead, on the other hand, did not talk that way. He did not talk about a single end toward which the whole of galactic evolution conspires. Um, but he did think that we live according to ends and goals, aspirational ideals. But he tended to think in terms of a plurality of ideals. Different situations have different ideals, different people have different ideals. He had norms, you know, violence is not an ideal, I mean, for him, but nonetheless, he was kind of a pluralist on the question of ideals. And I'm curious, in the arcane tradition, when you talk, it sounds to me sometimes like you're a bit more in the Teilhardian tradition
Yes.
than in the Whiteheadian tradition
Yes.
there. And so, in terms of the aspirational ideal, is there a name for it? You know, Teilhard called it omega. And is it a state in which all tension would be resolved? I think that's just a interesting question.
Michael or Catherine, do you want to respond? Or otherwise,
I can respond, and maybe you could add to it, Steve and Catherine,
okay.
if you want. I would say the answer is both yes and yes to that either or question, sort of, because the esoteric philosophy is based on, it sees time in many sense the same as Bergson does, eternal duration from a very sort of macrocosmic sense. But in like a more practical sense, time is seen as a cycle, and sort of we could say, like, from the standpoint of the soul, a cyclic spiral motion. So it's going around and around, but also sort of forward, not just sort of forward in space and time, but forward towards like an evolutionary destiny. But even that, but the whole basis is that, okay, we have sort of a relative point to reach, which, as far as we can possibly comprehend, is the resolution of the pairs of opposites of the basic duality, which the whole existence of the human being is based upon, which is soul and personality. But the traditions, the spiritual philosophy and also the spiritual training program is that eventually, and this is a very sort of high degree of attainment, when those two are unified and made one, when that unity is resolved, you enter a new and higher point of tension. And so it's that when you
A
get
higher
into the
point of tension, not an elimination of tension.
no, and so it always goes from one point of tension to another.
So that would sound a
Yeah.
little bit like vitality or intensity in a
Yeah.
Whiteheadian context.
Yeah, we call it initiation is what we would call it. But yeah.
The other interesting thing in relation to this is a sort of at a macro level, there's if you like, a cosmology that the Earth itself, the being, whatever we might call that, that is the Earth itself, is also on an evolutionary path, because the Earth is becoming a sacred planet.
Mm-hmm.
It's currently not a sacred planet. It's becoming its sort of initiatory path is becoming a sacred planet. And so that's and then this idea of a very central idea is the idea of the divine plan. In other words, and that's a Teilhardian sense of that there is purpose in the, if you like, the more defined being of the planetary life and all the kingdoms of nature within the planetary life, on a trajectory that is a part of the Earth itself becoming a sacred planet.
Mm-hmm.
And that is perfectly encapsulated, to my understanding, by Teilhard's view of moving into a sense of oneness.
Mm-hmm. Sounds
Moving
like
towards a collective, a consciousness of oneness. And this moment in time, however long that might be in history, but this moment in time is intimately involved with that.
I want to say a word about Telos and Whitehead, but not necessarily now, but I want to add a little caveat to how I presented Whitehead just for the sake of this. But let's move on. Catherine, do you have a thought on this?
Well, I don't think I have anything to add other than esoterically, the point of tension is considered to be within the will. And so, as long as there's evolution, there will be this point of tension that is a great creative phase of development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I add a little thought
Yeah,
in here?
please.
Um, some of my work in philosophy of music and phenomenology comes to mind here with the idea of harmony, and in particular, the Greek harmonia is not just consonants, right?
Yeah.
A harmonia is an entire scale, basically. And a scale is not just the notes, it can be played like you can I'm going into too much probably music theory, but you can tonicize the same 7 set of notes in 7 different ways by using whichever of those notes is your starting point, modal theory.
Mhm.
But within that, if you play all those notes at once, it's actually very dissonant. Harmonia is the thread, if you will, that connects the notes in a certain way, and sort of, you could think, composes the notes. And there's ways of composing the notes that are disharmonious, and that, like, that doesn't, I mean, every melody has dissonance within it, but there's a certain way of harmonically or harmonizing the dissonance within a melody. So really, it's the way in which all of these differences can hang together, these contrasts can coexist without eliminating those differences, but instead putting them together in a way that draws more out of them than they contain, and creates something greater than the sum of the parts. So I really see harmony not as at all an elimination of heterogeneity and difference and these things. Instead, it's a way of holding that together without homogenizing.
I've got to jump in, Jack, and
Please.
in Adventures of Ideas, toward the end, Whitehead asks, "What's it all come to? What's life about? What are we looking for? What's it all come to?" And the phrase that he uses um, is peace. He doesn't mean peace in a shallow sense, but he says peace is a sense, and this is his phrase, a harmony of harmonies.
Mm.
That's exactly his phrase. And he links it with beauty, because for him, this peace does not eliminate tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
It does not eliminate the sad side of life, but it gathers all of that together into a kind of harmony of harmonies that Jack, this is me speaking, I think includes dissonance as well as consonance. This is Jay McDaniel jumping in. But interestingly enough, that peace is also sometimes equated with God. What's called the consequent nature of God, Jack. It's the life of God as flowing on everlastingly, gathering all of the notes, I'll use the musical metaphor, into some kind of beauty. The interesting thing about peace and God, thus understood, is it's not necessarily in the future. It's actually what the universe, what we contribute to, it becomes part of God as we do it. As we do it, we become part of a larger harmony of harmonies that I would say includes dissonance as well as consonance, Jack.
Yeah.
All right. I said my piece about peace. That's it.
Steve, maybe we could go to a question from the audience.
Yeah, good.
Is that okay? Were you about to
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
follow-up?
No. You're good.
Okay. We just had one come in that's sort of an interesting one. He said, what would these philosophers and thinkers, well, what would they change? Maybe nothing, but what would they change? Or maybe you could answer, well, what does it mean? What would they change if they incorporated the law of rebirth, this law of reincarnation, into their
Interesting.
idea of, because it's a Eastern base. I don't know Confucianism that well, but my understanding in the East, generally it's a principle. In the West, it's definitely not. So I wonder if the East-West unification in these thinkers goes that far into this idea of rebirth.
My thought goes to Leibniz and the influence that Leibniz philosophy had on both Bergson and Whitehead. And for Leibniz, death doesn't exist, basically. Dying is like sleep, he says. So our true reality is this kind of monad. I'm not going to get into the trickiness of Leibniz system, but I think that there is a recasting of the monadology for sure in both Bergson and Whitehead. And it would be to say that, what we are is a force, let's say, a force of life. And that force of life is incapable of being destroyed. All it can do is go out of composition temporarily, which is the same as going to sleep. I think we see something like this in both of their thinking. And instead of thinking of a reincarnation of a personal pattern of experience and becoming, we're all the Elan Vital. We're all this same energy of life. And our composition may be singular, such that there's only one coming awake of my experience. But certainly that will be composed differently in the future. I don't know if Whitehead could go that far. Bergson does go that far, but he always says probably, like he has this caveat of the probability of the immortality of the soul, of life beyond this incarnation, these kind of ideas. I don't know if Jay, you have a thought.
Well, at one point in Whitehead's writings, he explores the possibility that the soul can continue after the death of the brain, after the death of the body. And his cosmology is open to that. Mm-hmm. There's nothing metaphysically impossible. And so he left it to what does the evidence suggest? Mm-hmm. It was not a metaphysical question, it was almost an empirical question. But someone who built upon that was David Ray Griffin. And David Ray Griffin did a very extensive study of parapsychology, and I put a link to his book, by the way, it's my only chat of the day, but if you click on that, you'll get the book I'm talking about. It's called Parapsychology, Spirituality, and something. And David Griffin explored out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences and empathy and psychokinesis. And the thing I like about Griffin is he was a skeptic. And so he did not approach it as an enthusiast, oh, this must be true. But he became convinced the more he actually looked at what he called the evidence, that it's actually more likely than not that there's a continuing journey after death. More likely than not. Does it take the form of reincarnation? Perhaps. He didn't speculate further, but I don't think of Whitehead's philosophy as incompatible with belief in reincarnation. Oh, by the way, some of the chapters in that book are on reincarnation, cases of the reincarnation type. There's been a lot of study of that. So I think maybe so. I think that's the spirit of the response.
Jay, what about the Chinese relationship with death? Chinese thinking about death.
Reincarnation is common in India, in Korea, Japan, etc. So it's by no means unique. It's in South Asia as well as East Asia, and elsewhere as well. When the communist revolution entered China, there was a sense in which all of our inherited cultural traditions were to be left aside. And the new God was science. And built into that was a kind of scientific materialism in the bad sense that Whitehead criticized. And so there's this whole generation of Chinese that have learned to think that science is true and the rest is superstition. However, they carried with them a sense, a feeling of supernatural phenomena, ghosts, and belief that maybe there is life after death. You know, you just couldn't kind of say it out loud at a party meeting, but you felt it, and you maybe even read books on it. But you know something, Steve, I think all of that is really changing. I think I'm talking about a China that was 40 years ago and 30 years ago. I think the atmosphere now is quite more open to much of that. You can go into a bookstore in China and you can get books on Taoism. You can get books on
Yeah,
Confucianism.
yeah.
You can get books on Buddhism, and they're proud of it. The hard thing to get will be a book on evangelical Christianity. Good luck on that one.
Just as the hard thing is to go into a bookshop in, you know, my hometown and find a book on deep Chinese thought.
So I think it's a different world now.
Yeah.
I think they're reclaiming a lot of their traditions.
Yeah.
I think so.
But yeah, I mean, just the whole approach to death that's, it seems to me, is in a terrifically dynamic
Yeah,
state, probably throughout the world. And that's one of the areas where we can expect experience and actually science, or in some ways science, to become more interested in the study of consciousness. You know,
I
I think
think so.
these near-death experiences, um, as they become scientific, really,
Yeah, and
are,
there's more and more study of that. So
yeah,
I don't think it's frightening and
yeah,
taboo
mm,
to consider that. I think
no,
we're in a new world with regard to consciousness and the relationship between mind and brain.
exactly. And the roles say that in medicine, the role that acupuncture and Chinese medicine, and then Ayurveda, Indian medicine, those two traditions, both of which have a modern scientific whole infrastructure. And it's interesting politically, just through the UN, seeing the way in which China tries to push acupuncture,
Mm,
and India tries to push Ayurveda,
mm,
but both of which are very positive signs, because they're whole new paradigms of the nature of form, the nature of the body.
right.
You know, and that to me is one of the most positive. I mean, the rise of the relationship between men and women in certainly in the West, to me, is one of the most extraordinary things that's in flux. The rise of the feminine, and the ways in which that's going, which you just have to observe. But that's a huge evolutionary thing in consciousness. And I suppose certainly in China, because China from Mao's time, of course, had all the very good ideology about the relations between men and women. I don't know how real that is in substance in modern China.
I don't think I can speak to that.
Yeah, okay.
Anything I say would be
Yeah,
partial truth,
yeah,
but partial not truth. Yeah.
yeah,
In terms of gender relations, it's
yeah,
very complicated.
yeah.
Mhm.
Not in China alone. Yeah.
Right.
Hey, Jack, you were just putting in some pieces. What were they?
Oh, somebody asked what Bergson books I would recommend, and I said The Creative Mind, which was a later book that he compiled a bunch of his earlier writings, kind of like a good entry point. And then Matter and Memory, I take as really his like magnum opus, although generally people think of Creative Evolution as the magnum opus. On the philosophical, spiritual, inner world exploring side of things, Matter and Memory is definitely the most transformative text. And then I also put up my YouTube channel just in case anybody's interested, because I have a ton of Bergson and otherwise videos on there. And Jay, am I right in thinking that there's going to be a Center of Process Studies conference in China next year or something like that? Matt was
You
just
know,
telling me this.
Jack, they kind of happen all the time now.
Okay.
There's one that just ended on education, process
Mm,
philosophy and education
mhm.
this past week.
Okay. Mhm.
So I can't keep track of it myself.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
but I
Matt
think the
just
answer is yes,
mentioned
I'm sure there is.
Matt mentioned one. I think it might even be in conjunction with this biophilosophy conference that we
Could
had
be.
this
Yeah,
past
yeah.
summer, and he was saying he wanted me to come, and I don't know if you would be there, but it would be awesome to meet you in China and talk about process philosophy and all of that.
Yeah, I hope
Hope,
so. Yeah, I hope so.
hopefully, I mean, one of the ideas that, for me from this seminar is that the network of esoteric thinkers will start watching these conferences, listening, because for all of us, it's where the circles of thought interpenetrate that is where the new is coming. And it's also where the intuition can most flourish. There's Alice Bailey, one of the big themes in Alice Bailey is that consciousness is, particularly a feeling nature, is
Mm,
veiled by glamour,
yeah.
veiled by they're part of it's part of form, it's part of substance. It's not bad, it's not wrong, but it's and the spiritual path is part of parting the veils to find actually harmony really in that field of feeling. And one of the techniques in work with that involves the intuition and just the sense that expectation of revelation. And not in any, like these are often looked at in psychic phenomenal terms. Our work, the esoteric work, isn't so interested in that at all. It's more interested in deeper revelation of meaning, such as what's coming through in the environmental movement. There's a deepening of understanding of relationship, and as and then this it's a little sort of meditation attitude, and then it ends with a strange thing saying. The fire of revelation comes, and to me, this is like the revelation of oneness. It is affecting human thought. It burns those who are touched by the revelation, meaning, well, I don't know what it means, but perhaps burning away some of the veils in a Buddhist sense, like the sword that brings clarity.
I
But
want to speak to Jack for a second on this. Jack, you're in an academic setting, and I was in one for 39 years, and so I know that world. Uh, it's my impression, but I want to know yours. The appeal to special revelation is not permitted in academic setting. Appeal to general revelation, so to speak, available to anybody and everybody.
yes,
Um,
yes.
but my students were not permitted to quote the Bible.
Mm, mhm,
If you had an opinion, you couldn't say because it was thus revealed.
mhm,
Muslim students were not permitted to quote the Quran. They could not say it was thus revealed. And behind that was the critique of special revelation
mhm,
that emerged in the Enlightenment. You just didn't do that in academic settings. Is
mhm.
that your impression as well? I'm really,
It is, and I think it's a living tension in our department and in our thinking because we are more open to that certainly
yeah.
than traditionally. But if you're writing a dissertation or something, you can't just say I had this intuitive download that led to X, Y, and Z. I mean, I love this question, and I think it's a really poignant question because even Descartes got his idea for the
Mm,
universal geometry in a dream. And so
mhm.
when he continues to wrestle with the question of dreams in the Cartesian meditate or not the Cartesian in the meditations of first philosophy, he he's really struggling with something existential for himself because he didn't think through logically all of the steps to prove the universal geometry, at least not from the start, right? I mean, he tried to do that afterwards and relied on these logical structures. And I mean, I think that our approach is still perhaps on the side of the logic side and the kind of like, you know, it may be the case, and we're very open to discussing it and thinking about it, that we could have these kind of intuitive, get the whole picture in one go, you know, even a sort of revelatory moment. But ultimately, within scholarship, we have to, you know, clean up and be scientific and present things in a way that sounds like causal stages in a unfolding.
So I think the arcane tradition, and correct me, I just really want to know, does make an appeal to special revelation.
Not
Let
in,
me ask, let
yeah,
me ask that question. Let me ask
yeah,
that question.
not in the sense you're thinking. Well, in a glamored sense, yes, I would say. So to me, every tradition has its glamored perspectives, and you certainly in the Alice Bailey tradition will see that. In other words, as you say, I've had this download. What the tradition is really speaking about is a collective revelation, not an authority. So in our tradition, I mean, for example, in the arcane school, we actually discourage people from citing Alice Bailey.
Okay, yeah.
Because for exactly the same reasons that you're speaking of, because we're trying, like the whole thing is about training and creative thought and the realities of this relationship between the soul or the lure and the brain consciousness. And it's easy to go back and just quote what someone else has said. But it's important to be honest about the liminal reality of my experience, not just my experience, my understanding, how I conceive of these things. So the sense of revelation that I was speaking of was not about that, which can also be often delusional, but about something in the collective. And this is why, for me, this whole ecological vision that's coming has come like a revelation, and it's sweeping through thought. Every profession, this for me, every profession, if you look at the deep thinkers, they are looking at relationships more than they're looking at whereas in the past they looked at small defined areas. There's now a huge sort of creativity around seeing the whole in intelligent, you know, clarified, clear, rational terms. And the point I was making was that in this particular little piece, it says, which is really, I think, coming into what you're saying, it says that after the revelation, what will happen is the revelation will succumb to doctrine and dogma. That's what happens when something comes into form. It becomes like this, referring to an authority. But in the meantime, the intuitives will keep working, and the sort of creative thought will move into new areas. Whether that makes any sense.
Thanks, Steve. That's a good explanation. I would just draw like one line back to something we discussed briefly with in my discussion with Jack, which is, well, also just to say, in the esoteric philosophy, there is no revelation or there is no intuition in form. It's as similar to Bergson. So every intuition, the pure reason or whatever you want to call it, has to come down into a form, and that every form therefore is a doctrine. And so in that sense, actually all the major philosophers are bringing forward actually revealed teachings from an esoteric point of view, or at least a lot of what they bring through, like, as you say, Descartes, but also others, even if they don't claim that it was brought down that way. The whole esoteric philosophy works from the universals to the particulars, and it sees evolution as occurring actually from above And so that's one of the major differences between the way a lot of other non-esoteric philosophies see the evolution of life, is that it evolves from above, and so not in a Darwinian sense from below. But I think what we were saying earlier, Jack, about this movement of the past or of memory into the present and the dissolution is exactly the act of revelation. Actually, it's when the whole past sort of comes together, and then you have the sort of moment, and then perhaps like that elastic band you were talking about, or the bow. Yeah. I just want to declare. I'm sorry, I just jumped in for.
No, it's
Yeah.
I'm watching time, Michael. What time?
Well, I think Catherine had a question. I
Yeah,
know she had mentioned she wanted to bring forward, so maybe we could even end with that.
yeah, perfect.
Well,
And
I was listening. I've been listening to the conversation, and especially the parts about the conversations that are going on in China, and thinking those could be happening right here. And it's encouraging to recognize that maybe these are human questions, and that they could be an important place where our two cultures find common ground, to stand on. And esoterically, humanity has an essential role to play in the evolutionary process. And I don't know if it's time now, Steve or Michael, I prepared a little.
Yeah, please.
So, okay, I don't know what our time frame is, but this is anyway. And it's been really delightful for me to be part of this exploration of these ideas that we've covered this afternoon. And I was thinking about what the Ageless Wisdom has to say about the role of humanity in these creative processes, the process of an emerging new culture. And what is it can we do if, Jay, I think you said this is our moment. If this is our moment, what is it that we can do? So the Ageless Wisdom would tell us that the philosophy concerns humanity's relationship with God and considers humanity's cooperation with divine will to be essential to all evolutionary development, for our free will is absolute. Spiritual ideas are given, and we humans must build in thought the pathways to their manifestation. Three of the pathways that we must build are invocation, ritual, and goodwill. So invocation is the intelligent organization of spiritual energy and the forces of love, which Teilhard might appreciate. An expression of the natural urge of life to reach upwards towards light. It gives form to the power latent in life itself and relates all forms to their spiritual essence, invocation. It cannot be separated from evocation, however, for that which is lower inevitably evokes that which is higher. Thus, the response of spiritual beings to our invocation is certain. It is we who may not recognize the fulfilling of what has been called. Rituals are commonly known as religious ceremonies, but any rhythmic activity performed with devotional intent and a clear sense of the sacred can be a ritual. Rituals are known as group activity even when performed alone, for they synchronize the rhythms of the individual life with those of the group life of the soul. It is thought they will become increasingly potent in the coming age. Goodwill is said to be one of the most basic spiritual qualities of the human being. the energetic source of all right human relationships. It is harmlessness in action, grounded in knowledge of the underlying oneness of humanity, the whole planet, and all life upon it. Goodwill is a sensed responsibility for helping to resolve the problems confronting us at this time, essential to the emergence of the new unity we seek. And in a minute, we will come together in the meditation of the energy of goodwill. And that we will be using at the close of this event includes a world prayer, the great invocation that aligns all three of these pathways into a single invocative act. And I think we've already listed in the chat the link, the web link to the web page for the Great Invocation. So my question would be, and I think it's been so well, we've really addressed it throughout this entire conference, about how creativity would be seen differently in the East from how it's seen in the esoteric traditions. In the East, what would be the role of humanity in bringing into form the new ideas that are arising from spiritual realms? And then so much of what we study in the Alice Bailey works is aligned with Abrahamic values, prayer, rituals, and concern and care for the others. And we've already talked a bit about how these are expressed in the East and in China in particular. So, but if people have any more comments on those, now would be a good time to share them. So, but thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Well, if that was an invitation to say a bit more, I could say just very briefly that Nishida's first major work is an inquiry into the good, and he was really concerned with what we might call like axiological. That's a fancy word in philosophy for just the existence of purpose and meaning and these questions. And I do think that it's a central concern of Nishida's, and in Bergson, for example, like we don't have him talk about the good much at all, but it's clear that his whole philosophy is oriented in that way, and that he really he thinks that our mental faculties, our ability to look at the world and know where we're going and all of these things limit us so that we can't say black and white that there's good and evil. But that the good for Bergson, if we want to push him there, is our openness and our plasticity to adapting and, progressing and evolving our valuation, our sense of purpose and goodness, and expanding it, I guess, and evolving it.
So our participation is seen as essential in bringing these new concepts into form, or
exactly,
as Steve said, clothing them with glamour and bringing them into form.
Yeah.
So,
Catherine, I just want to say that I thought that your liturgy, that's what I would call it, was absolutely beautiful.
thank you, Jay.
And each of the themes, was it invocation, evocation, kind of together there?
Together.
and
Yes,
then ritual,
right.
and then goodwill,
Goodwill. Yes.
uh, oriented toward love.
Of course.
You got my theology.
Well, Jay, I learned a lot of it from you, I think.
Well, whoever your teacher was, I like your teacher. No, really, there's nothing more to say. I think that captured it so deeply and so richly. I really appreciate that. It touched my heart,
Thank you.
all three.
Beautiful. I think that, thank you so much. Thank you, Catherine, for that. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Jack. This to me has been a beautifully rich time, and really very grateful. Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
We're going
And
to move on to
grateful. Grateful.
Peaceful.
That's a good word for
Thank
it.
you all so much.
Thank you.
Chris.
Don't think my video is showing, but
There you
that's
go.
fine.
Chris, we can see you fine.
Can you? Oh,
We can
okay.
see you, yeah. Even though you may not be able to see yourself, we can
Oh,
see you.
no, I can't.
Okay.
Okay, but thank
You're looking wonderful, Chris. You're looking great. That threw you out.
We spoke too soon, Chris.
Yeah,
Now you've gone. Chris, I think she may have left the meeting, Steve.
something.
Yes, she's left the meeting.
Yeah, she's not in here anymore.
Maybe she'll come back. If let's wait for a second. If not, Michael, will you take us through the meditation?
Yeah, I can do that. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. We'll just wait just a few minutes if people want to use the silence maybe to prepare. It may just take her a few seconds to log back on.
Yeah.
Be great to have, Chris concluding this meditation. I do want to say just apologies to everyone. We didn't get to a lot of your questions in the chat, and there's a lot of great questions in there. I had a few more of myself that were really interesting. So this could have been maybe a 4-hour seminar or something, or much longer, and would have just but we will forward the chat to both the speakers, and so they'll have a chance to read those. We were
I think, Michael, why
Shall we
don't we?
go ahead?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
All right. So, well, we'll go ahead and do the meditation now, and then Chris, if she comes back on, she could, say a few words at the end if she wanted to. But those of you that are leaving now, just a huge thank you to all of you for coming, and of course a huge thank you to our speakers as well. It's been magnificent. Obviously, we couldn't have done it without you. So, we'll go now into our meditation on goodwill. So we begin by linking up in thought with all those people throughout the world who are working with this goodwill meditation group. We reflect upon the fact of relationship. You are related to your family, to your community, to your nation, to the world of nations, and to the one humanity made up of all races and nations. We use this mantra of unification. We say together, the souls of all are one, and I am one with them. I seek to love, not hate. I seek to serve and not exact due service. I seek to heal, not hurt. Let pain bring due reward of light and love. Let the soul control the outer form and life and all events, and bring to light the love that underlies the happenings of the time. Let vision come and insight. Let the future stand revealed. Let inner union demonstrate and outer cleavages be gone. Let love prevail. Let all people love. Reflect upon your own and humanity's relationship with all beings who dwell in the higher realms of mind and heart. This is the spiritual hierarchy of saints, of rishis, of bodhisattvas, and of masters which are honored by all the world's religions and spiritual groups. Imagine that you are standing together with the group within the center of the spiritual hierarchy, the spiritual heart of our planetary life, immersed in the consciousness of the heart of love. For some, this heart of love is known as the Christ, and other faiths have other names for the one at the center. From this high point, let your thoughts reach out to include all members of the human family into whom the energy of goodwill is active. Sound the affirmation of love. In the center of all love, I stand. From that center, I, the soul, will outward move. From that center, I, the one who serves, will work. May the love of the divine self be shed abroad, in my heart, through my group, and throughout the world. We visualize the energy of love flowing from the spiritual hierarchy through the men and women of goodwill and into the hearts and minds of all people, infusing them with goodwill and creating loving and harmonious human relationships. Meditate on ways of spreading goodwill, creating right human relationships, and restoring peace on earth. Realize that you are helping to build a channel between the spiritual hierarchy and humanity, through which this energy of goodwill may flow, uniting the human family, solving its problems, and healing all cleavages. Linked in thought with the men and women of goodwill all over the world, we say the great invocation. We will use today the adapted version of the great invocation. We will say it with deliberation and with full commitment to its meaning, knowing that you are radiating its potent energies to humanity. From the point of light within the mind of God, let light stream forth into human minds. Let light descend on earth. From the point of love within the heart of God, let love stream forth into human hearts. May the coming one return to earth. From the center, where the will of God is known, let purpose guide all little human wills, the purpose which the masters know and serve. From the center, which we call the human race, let the plan of love and light work out, and may it seal the door where evil dwells. Let light and love and power restore the plan on earth. Oh. Oh. Thank you, everyone, so much for today's work. Thank you again to Jack Bagby and Jay McDaniel. Thank you to Steve and Catherine and Chris also for your contributions. Thank you for all of you who attended today. And a special thank you also to our translators who translated this whole webinar, this whole seminar into Spanish simultaneous, which is not so easy. So these were volunteer translators. And so thank you all so much for your service in that regard. We'll throw up just a few upcoming meetings. And so if you'd like to know any additional information about these, maybe you're new to our work, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And we're happy to discuss more. We'll put our contact information in the chat box. You can also go to our website, www.lucistrust.org. Thank you all, and good evening.